back. So glad you're here. So this video is continuing a discussion of the way in which Aquinas' arguments for the identity of being and goodness apply to a moral argument for theism. And in previous videos, I've argued that Aquinas has four ways to good, and that those four distinct arguments for the identity of being and goodness are both valid and sound. And in a previous video, I tried to make an argument for the metaphysical fact that because Aquinas' arguments for the identity of being and goodness are successful, that necessarily implies that anything that exists has within it a formal reality, the identity of being and goodness. So the identity of being and goodness inheres in anything that's real. Okay. So now what I want to do is consider that as it connects to one of Aquinas' famous 5 ways to God. And this is called the 5th way to God. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. This is from section 3 of my paper called The Identity of Being and Goodness, in Logic of the Identity of Being and Goodness and a Moral Argument for Theism, which came out in the fall of 2024 in the European Journal for the Study of Thomas Aquinas. So this is part 3 of that paper, and this section is called The Identity of Being Good Considered with Aquinas' 5th way to God. So what I've shown is the validity of Aquinas' arguments to the conclusion that being and good are identical in things, and I've shown how the validity of such arguments implies the existence of a formal reality, existence identical to goodness. And now we can consider how those truths are related to Aquinas' 5th way argument for the existence of God. Then in the next section, probably another video, I'll show how the results of that inquiry undergird a contemporary moral argument for theism. So here in this section, in this video, we'll first offer a brief exposition of Aquinas' 5th way, elaborating on the notion of acting for an end. And then I want to show how the notion is intimately connected with Aquinas' claim that being and good are identical in things. And then thirdly, transition into a discussion of how acting for an end and the identity of being good connect to a moral argument for theism. Okay, so this is 3.1 here in this section. Aquinas' 5th way to God and acting for an end. So here's Aquinas' 5th way. This is from the Summa, section 1, question 2, article 3, followed by a brief exposition of the notion of acting for an end. The 5th way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. And this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way as to obtain the same result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, they do achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move toward an end unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Yes, that's the end of the quotation from Aquinas. I promise we'll get to the moral argument. Some of you are interested in Aquinas, like, yeah, I've heard this argument before. That's a pretty good one. So we'll keep going here with a little exposition. So the salient part of this argument for our purposes is the notion of acting for an end and achieving their relevant end. This is relevant to Aquinas' understanding of the nature of existence as essential actualization and of goodness as the completion of any appetent, or a desire, apheatai in Greek, of any existent thing. It's a goal-directedness, an aim-attedness of anything that exists. This is where the identity relation of being and goodness becomes relevant. It's important to note that acting for an end is just acting for an end in one sense just is the exemplification of an essence. It is the apheatai, or the aim-atness, translated into Latin as appetent, in English as desire. Again, in a previous video I talked about how desire and appetite, probably not the best translations, but aim-atness, that's exactly right for anything that lacks either will or mind or any kind of biological directiveness. Being itself is the fulfillment of an aim-atness. Anything that exists is necessarily the completion of an essential nature once it's actualized. It moves from potency to act, from non-being to being. Okay. 3.2. Acting for an end and the identity of being and good. So let us turn now to see how the notion of acting for an end connects with the identity of being and goodness in things. When Aquinas quotes the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and says goodness is what all desire, In Latin, it's bonum est quod omnium appetunt. The Latin term appetunt is rendered as desire, but this seems absurd at first glance. Merely physical things. A carbon atom, for example, a hydrogen atom, whatever you like. They don't have desires. They don't have mental or emotional states at all. And when they share this, and they share this with many other things that exist. However, the Latin term appetunt might help. The Latin word is where we derive our English term appetite. But at the same time, this doesn't seem to do much better than desire. Carbon atoms are not hungry. They don't have an appetite, like I have an appetite for double-double or a carne asada burrito or something like that. The Greek term from which the Latin appetunt and the English term desire derive might be helpful. The Greek term is epheatai. It means aim at, or like, for example, throwing a spear or a dart. This seems to help. Any existing thing necessarily in its own existence aims at its own actualization, since existence just is essential actualization. Now, this is a view that's held by me and other philosophers. I have a book on this called The Heresy of Heresies, a defense of Christian common sense realism, if you want to take a look at my arguments for that claim. And I rely on Aquinas and George Coubertin's and a few others that are similar to him, Jacques Maritain, among others. J.P. Moreland also has a similar view, although he derives his view very differently than I do. So every being has a desire, a natural appetency, a real aim atness in its essence. Further, when that essence is actualized, that aim atness of the essence is complete and perfected in terms of its moving from potentiality to actuality. Just in virtue of its existence, its esse, E-S-S-E, it's kind of a unique Latin term, or essential actualization. This is something that we can be aware of when we experience anything that exists. When we are aware of any existing thing, we are aware of an essence that aims at or desires, aims toward its own existence. When we know an existing thing, we are aware of the completion and perfection of an essence as far as the thing exists. This awareness of a natural fulfillment of aim atness, natural appetency or desire, is what Aquinas means by goodness, presenting the aspect of desirableness, which being or existence understood merely as essential actualization does not present. The relation is the same, but we can think of it in different ways. That's what Aquinas says when his famous first way to good is where he says, but goodness presents this. When we think about goodness, we're thinking about that aspect of being, which is the fulfillment of the aim atness of an essential nature. Okay. Thus, the distinction between being and good can be held in our minds. There's really an identity in things. Okay. Third point here. Acting for an ends, the identity of being and good, and arguments for theism. Now we can see how acting for an end and the identity of being and good connects to arguments for theism, including a moral argument. It is the real identity of being and good that Aquinas emphasizes when he writes of things acting for an end. Further, and most relevant to arguments for theism, the aim atness of existence in any object does not get there by itself. It needs an explanation. It will certainly need an explanation when we consider human existence. For when we consider human existence, which is a complex reality, the identity of being and good is present just as it is in less complex beings. There is an ontic order of our existence entailing the identity of our ontic goodness. But unlike simpler beings, for example, the carbon atom, the completion of our being involves a moral order, as we are moral beings. Now, if you think that a single carbon atom has a will and a desire and a mind, like you and I have minds or wills and desires, well, that might be an interesting argument to hear. And maybe there are some philosophies that take that route. But look, I mean, if I just took a piece of coal or a piece of plastic, maybe there's some plastic cup or a piece of metal or a piece of brick, or just take H2O, like you see behind me here. I don't think it has a mind. I don't think you do either. Now, of course, you can argue that if you like, but I think that's a hard position to prove. if not impossible. Okay. So I'm going to take it to be obvious that the carbon atoms don't have minds and wills. Therefore, they can't be moral beings. The full completion of our human essential nature as moral beings will involve the full exemplification of the virtues directed towards our completion and a summum bonum, the greatest good, the final and complete actualization of our essential nature. Okay, so, in other words, the completion of an essential nature that's more complex is going to be more complex on the goodness side too. Maybe let me put that another way. The more complex an essential nature, the more complex the goodness of that being. In other words, since being and good are identical, then the greater the being, the greater the good. Or the more complex the being, the more complex the good. And moral goodness is on a magnitude of order that's more complex than the simple goodness of a carbon atom. Both are good in one sense, human goodness and the goodness of a carbon atom in terms of their being. But the carbon atom lacks morality, moral goodness, that the rational agents have. Okay. So the account of a full human well-being will need an explanation, with the explanation pointing to the existence of God. This is how the identity relation of being and good, discussed in the previous video, can be used to point to the existence of God. Since being and good are identical, any argument that explains the being of any existent thing also explains the goodness of that existence as well. In addition, any argument that explains the goodness of an existent is also explaining the being of that existent. Right? So if goodness and being are identical, if you explain one, you explain the other, or vice versa. Whether a philosopher focuses on being or on good, since the two are identical and both need an explanation for their existence, they will both have the capacity to point us to God. Okay? So this is kind of interesting, because any argument for theism that relies on being, say a cosmological argument, necessarily brings with it a moral argument, because being and good are identical. Now, we have to separate them out conceptually. I think that's what the moral argument is going to do, and maybe in a more powerful way, so that we can see the fullness of being and goodness, and how they both point to God in a moral argument. Okay, so I think that's it for this video. The next video, I'm going to go directly into the moral argument and show how the identity of being and good apply to a contemporary moral argument. I think I'm going to use, I use an argument by William Lane Craig, or one similar to that. And the argument is this. I'll just preview for the next video. The simplified moral argument, I'm calling this simplified moral argument, goes like this. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist. Moral values exist, therefore God exists. Okay. So this is a valid argument, and what I want to do is show how the identity of being and goodness in Aquinas' views, his four ways to good, and the existence of identity of being and good relation that exists in all things, contributes to, or under, maybe say grounds, if you want to put it that way, grounds a kind of simplified moral argument. All right, thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.